They found something in Greenland that shouldn't exist. Beneath 2 miles of ice, radar detected what appeared to be a perfectly preserved ancient landscape, complete with riverbeds, lake basins, and evidence of vegetation that hasn't seen sunlight in over 3 million years. NASA scientists at the Goddard Space Flight Center have analyzed the data repeatedly, and none can explain how an entire ecosystem could survive beneath a frozen tomb that predates human existence itself. What you're about to see challenges everything we thought we knew about how civilizations adapt to extreme environments. And the most disturbing part? We're only discovering these secrets now because the ice is disappearing. And with each passing summer, we're in a race against time to document what rises from the cold before erosion, exposure, and scavenging animals destroy evidence that waited millennia to be found. This isn't speculation. This is verified research from institutions including the University of Copenhagen, the Greenland National Museum, and international polar research teams who have dedicated their careers to understanding what the ice has hidden. Every site we'll explore today exists. Every artifact we'll discuss has been cataloged, photographed, and studied. And every mystery we'll uncover remains, despite decades of scientific investigation, genuinely unexplained. Greenland holds a unique position in archaeological research. As the world's largest island, its ice sheet covers approximately 1.7 million square kilometers, roughly 80% of its total landmass. For most of human history, researchers assumed this frozen expanse was simply that, frozen, lifeless, and archaeologically irrelevant. That assumption has proven catastrophically wrong. The ice didn't just cover empty rock. It froze in place ancient hunting grounds, preserved organic materials that would have decomposed anywhere else, and maintained DNA evidence so pristine that scientists have successfully sequenced the genomes of individuals who died 4,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt reached their current form. What makes Greenlandic archaeology uniquely haunting is the paradox of its revelation. Climate change, the same force threatening modern civilization, is simultaneously giving and taking away. Each summer, as temperatures rise and ice retreats, sites emerge that have been sealed since the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, or even earlier. Teams scramble to excavate before winter returns, or before the newly exposed materials, suddenly vulnerable to oxygen and bacteria, crumble into dust. We are, in the most literal sense, discovering these mysteries too late. Too late to study them properly, too late to preserve them adequately, and perhaps too late to understand what messages these ancient peoples tried to leave for us. The mysteries we'll examine today span 4,000 years of human presence in one of Earth's most hostile environments. We'll explore why an entire Norse civilization vanished without explanation, leaving behind their churches and their cattle, but apparently unable or unwilling to adapt. We'll examine mummified bodies whose burial circumstances have puzzled researchers for half a century. We'll investigate a genetic puzzle that suggests ancient Greenlanders had connections to populations that seemingly couldn't have existed. And we'll witness what melting ice patches are revealing about prehistoric hunting practices so sophisticated that modern engineers struggle to replicate them. These are not abstract academic questions. They're intimate human stories written in bone and stone and frozen sinew. They're the last testimony of peoples who face challenges we're only beginning to understand. And they're disappearing. Let's begin where the mystery cuts deepest, with 8 bodies frozen in time, their faces still visible after 500 years. On an October afternoon in 1972, 2 brothers named Hans and Joachim Grunwald were hunting ptarmigan near the small settlement of Uummannaq in northwestern Greenland. The terrain here is unforgiving. Sheer cliffs drop into frigid waters, and the rocky outcrops offer little shelter from winds that can freeze exposed skin within minutes. The Grunwald brothers knew this landscape intimately. They had hunted it their entire lives, which is precisely why what they found was so unsettling. Beneath a rock overhang, barely visible unless you approached from a specific angle, the brothers noticed what appeared to be carefully stacked stones. Greenland's coast is littered with ancient cairns and tent rings, so initially the discovery seemed routine. But as they investigated, pulling away the protective covering of flat rocks, they realized they were looking at human faces, not skulls. Faces. The cold, dry conditions of the overhang had preserved not just bone, but skin, hair, and clothing. 8 individuals lay in 2 separate graves, positioned as if sleeping. Their features so intact that the brothers initially believed they might be recent deaths. Only the style of their clothing, distinctly traditional Inuit garments they recognized from historical photographs, suggested otherwise. The Grunvold brothers reported their discovery to Danish authorities, but 6 years would pass before a formal archaeological expedition arrived. When researchers from the Greenland National Museum finally examined the site in 1978, they encountered a mystery that continues to haunt Arctic archaeology. The location itself raises questions. Qilakitsoq translates roughly to "the sky is low" in Qilakitsoq, the Greenlandic language. The overhang sits approximately 450 meters above sea level, accessible only by difficult climbing. This wasn't a convenient burial location. Whoever placed these bodies here did so deliberately, choosing a spot that required significant effort to reach. A spot where the specific microclimate of cold, dry air and protection from precipitation created natural mummification conditions. Did they know this would happen? Did they intentionally select a location that would preserve their dead for centuries? And if so, why? The 8 mummies represented 6 adult women and 2 children, a 6-month-old infant and a boy approximately 4 years old. Carbon dating placed their deaths around 1475 CE, roughly 15 years before Columbus reached the Caribbean. Their preservation exceeded anything researchers had encountered in Arctic contexts. The infant's face remained so perfectly intact that his features were immediately identifiable. His closed eyes, rounded cheeks, and small nose appeared almost lifelike. Museum scientists later created a reconstruction showing exactly how he would have looked in life, an image that became one of the most recognizable in Greenlandic history. Clothing analysis revealed remarkable sophistication. The women wore up to 5 layers of garments, primarily sealskin with some caribou fur, stitched with sinew thread in patterns that demonstrated exceptional skill. One woman's parka contained 78 separate pieces of skin, each carefully cut and assembled. The craftsmanship wasn't merely functional, it was artistic. But here's where the evidence becomes truly strange. Initial examination suggested that several individuals had died from natural causes, disease or old age. However, detailed CT scanning conducted by researchers at the Natural History Museum of Denmark in the 1980s revealed anomalies that have never been adequately explained. The 4-year-old boy showed signs of Down syndrome, a genetic condition that would have required significant community support for his survival to that age. His presence in the burial, positioned with apparent care, suggests a society that valued individuals regardless of physical or cognitive differences, a finding that challenges simplistic assumptions about prehistoric priorities. More troubling was the infant. Initial reports suggested he might have been buried alive, a practice documented in some historical Inuit communities where a nursing child might be buried with its deceased mother if no other woman could nurse it. However, subsequent analysis questioned this interpretation. The infant showed no signs of trauma, and his positioning suggested gentle placement rather than struggle. 3 of the women showed evidence of a facial tattoo tradition, parallel lines across the chin and cheeks created by pulling soot-covered thread beneath the skin. This practice was common among Inuit women and typically indicated marital status or lineage. But one woman's tattoos were partially healed, suggesting she was relatively young when she died, while her internal examination revealed she had borne multiple children. The timeline seemed compressed, difficult to reconcile. The University of Copenhagen's Department of Forensic Medicine conducted extensive studies through the 1980s and 1990s. Dr. Jens Peter Hart Hansen led multiple examinations, employing emerging technologies as they became available. X-ray analysis revealed that several women suffered from significant health problems during their lives. Evidence of pulmonary disease, likely tuberculosis, appeared in multiple individuals. Kidney stones caused considerable pain for at least one woman. Another showed signs of a tumor near her base of skull that would have caused headaches and possibly vision problems. Yet none of these conditions definitively explained death. The body showed no signs of violence, no evidence of starvation, no clear acute illness that would have killed 8 people in what appeared to be a short time frame. Genetic analysis conducted in the 2000s added another layer of complexity. DNA testing revealed that the women were related, mothers and daughters spanning at least 2 generations. The 2 children were also related to specific women in the group. This was a family burial. But why did they all die together? Why were they buried in this remote, difficult-to-access location? And why only women and children? Where were the men of this family? Now, I want to know what you think about this next detail, because it's the one thing that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Among the grave goods, researchers found no hunting equipment, unusual for Inuit burials, where tools for the afterlife were typically included. The only items present were those directly worn or used by women: needle cases, ulu knives, and ornamental objects. Does this remind you of anything you've seen or heard about? Let me know, because every perspective helps piece together this puzzle. The absence of male tools suggests either that men were buried elsewhere or that this burial had a specific gender-related significance. Some researchers propose that a disease swept through the settlement, killing family members in sequence, and that the survivors, likely men who then died or relocated, buried their relatives in the ancestral manner before departing. But this remains speculation. The conservative interpretation suggests a disease outbreak, possibly introduced through contact with European whalers who had begun operating in Greenlandic waters during the 15th century. This would explain multiple deaths in a short period and the apparent haste of the burial. Tuberculosis, smallpox, or other old-world diseases devastated indigenous populations throughout the Americas. Greenland would have been no exception. A more radical theory proposes that this wasn't a crisis burial, but a deliberate, planned interment. Proponents point to the sophisticated preservation, the careful positioning, the protective stone covering, the selection of a microclimate ideal for mummification. They suggest the community understood that this location would preserve their dead and chose it for spiritual or cultural reasons we cannot access from the archaeological record alone. The fringe theory, discussed quietly among some researchers, questions whether all 8 individuals died of natural causes at all. The absence of male relatives, the perfect preservation, and the remote location have led some to speculate about ritual practices, exile, or even execution. Historical accounts from other Arctic cultures describe situations where individuals deemed spiritually dangerous were isolated or killed by their communities. Could something similar have occurred here? Each theory fails on specific points. The disease hypothesis doesn't explain the careful burial or the selection of this specific site. The planned interment theory doesn't account for the apparent family connection. Why would a community plan to bury an entire family lineage simultaneously? And the ritual hypothesis, while provocative, has no supporting evidence from contemporary Inuit traditions. Imagine standing on that windswept ledge in 1475. The sea stretches endless below, chunks of ice grinding against each other with sounds like distant thunder. You've carried a body here, your mother, perhaps, or your sister, struggling against gravity and cold. your muscles burning with effort. You place her beside others already here, arranging her limbs gently, ensuring her clothing lies properly. Why here? What about this place made the difficulty worth it? The Qilakitsoq people lived at the boundary between survival and death every day. The average temperature hovers around -8 degrees Celsius. Hunting required extraordinary skill and significant luck. Starvation was never more than a few bad weeks away. And yet they created art. Their clothing featured decorative elements, contrasting fur patterns, ornamental toggles that served no functional purpose. Their needle cases bore carved designs. They tattooed their faces in elaborate patterns that required hours of painful effort. These weren't people merely surviving. They were living fully, expressing themselves aesthetically, caring for their sick and disabled, honoring their dead with burials that required tremendous effort. The 6-month-old infant, the 4-year-old boy with Down syndrome, their presence in this burial tells us that these people loved their vulnerable members and grieved when they died. Today, the Qilakitsoq mummies are displayed at the Greenland National Museum in Nuuk, the capital city. Climate-controlled cases maintain the conditions necessary for their continued preservation. Visitors can see them remarkably close enough to observe the texture of preserved skin, the patterns of clothing stitches, the features of faces that last saw sunlight over 500 years ago. The display has not been without controversy. Some contemporary Greenlanders have questioned whether displaying human remains, particularly those of ancestors, is appropriate. In 2017, discussions began about potentially returning the mummies to a burial site, though no action has been taken. Meanwhile, the original site at Qilakitsoq remains accessible to visitors willing to make the challenging hike. The rock overhang still shelters the location where the bodies lay for half a millennium. Stones similar to those that covered the graves are scattered nearby, some still stained with the organic material that leached from the burials. Standing there, 500 years collapses into nothing. The wind sounds the same, the ice moves the same, and the dead, now removed but somehow still present, pose their silent questions. My assessment is that the Qilakitsoq mummies represent something more profound than an archaeological puzzle. They're a meditation on love and loss in extreme circumstances. These people face challenges that would crush most modern humans: cold that kills in hours, darkness that lasts months, food scarcity that requires daily confrontation with mortality. And they responded with tenderness. They carried their dead to a beautiful, difficult place. They arranged their bodies with care. They protected them with stones and trusted the cold to preserve what they couldn't keep alive. What does it mean to honor the dead in a world that offers so little margin for survival? How do we balance the needs of the living against respect for those who've passed? These questions aren't ancient. We face them now, today, in hospitals and funeral homes and bedside vigils. The Qilakitsoq dead have much to teach us, if we're willing to learn. But their most fundamental lesson remains unanswered. What happened to bring 8 people, a family, related by blood and love, to their ends in such close proximity? We may never know. The ice that preserved them didn't preserve their stories. In 1990, 2 caribou hunters from the modern settlement of Nuuk stumbled upon something impossible. Protruding from the edge of a melting glacier near the Qilakitsoq area in the southwest of Greenland, they saw what appeared to be wooden beams. Further investigation revealed wattle and daub walls, stone foundations, and artifacts that clearly weren't Inuit in origin. They had found a Norse farm, but not just any farm. This one had been buried beneath the advancing ice of the Little Ice Age, and was now, centuries later, emerging again as the glacier retreated. Researchers named it Gord Under Sanded, or the farm beneath the sand, and it would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North Atlantic history. The farm dated to approximately 1,000 1400 CE, spanning nearly the entire period of Norse occupation in Greenland. But its significance lay not in its typicality, but in its preservation. Unlike most Norse sites, which had been exposed to centuries of erosion and reuse, this farm had been sealed beneath ice, its organic materials protected from decay. Wood, textiles, bone implements, and even the remains of the final meals eaten by its inhabitants were preserved. What researchers found there would fundamentally reshape our understanding of Norse Greenlandic society and deepen the mystery of why it completely disappeared. The Norse established 2 settlement areas in Greenland around 985 CE, the eastern settlement near modern Qilakitsoq in the south, and the western settlement near modern Nuuk. At their peak, these settlements may have contained over 5,000 people, complete with churches, a bishop's residence, farmsteads, and regular communication with Iceland and Norway. Then they vanished. The western settlement was abandoned sometime in the mid-14th century. The eastern settlement held on longer, but was certainly gone by the early 15th century. When European explorers returned to Greenland in the 1700s, they found no trace of Norse inhabitants, only ruins, and the Inuit peoples who had been in the Arctic for thousands of years. This disappearance represents one of the great mysteries of medieval history. The Norse were experienced colonizers who had successfully settled Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and briefly even North America. They possessed iron tools, domesticated animals, and sophisticated agricultural knowledge. How did an entire society, complete with churches and estates and trade networks, simply cease to exist? The farm beneath the sand provided new evidence, but no clear answers. Excavations led by archaeologist Joel Berglund revealed several disturbing details. First, the farm showed no signs of violence. There were no burned structures, no scattered weapons, no hastily buried dead. Whatever happened, it wasn't a sudden attack. Second, the final layers of occupation showed a shift in diet. Earlier deposits contained primarily the bones of cattle and sheep, the traditional Norse farming diet. But later layers showed increasing reliance on seal meat, particularly ringed seals, which had been a staple of Inuit diet for millennia. The Norse were adapting to their environment, adopting hunting practices from their neighbors. Third, and most puzzling, valuable items remained in the farm. Iron implements, rare in Greenland where no ore exists, were left behind. Whetstones, needles, and other essential tools lay as if waiting for owners who never returned. If the inhabitants left voluntarily, why didn't they take these irreplaceable items? Radiocarbon dating placed the final occupation around 1350 CE. At this time, the Black Death was devastating Europe, and the Little Ice Age was making Greenland's already marginal farmland increasingly difficult to work. Climate models suggest temperatures may have dropped by several degrees Celsius, shortening growing seasons and increasing sea ice that would have blocked the vital supply ships from Europe. But none of this explains the total disappearance. People can move. People can adapt. The Inuit survived the same climate changes using different strategies. Why couldn't the Norse? Extensive excavations of Norse Greenlandic sites have been conducted by the Danish National Museum, the Greenland National Museum, and various international partners. The eastern settlement alone contained over 400 farms and at least 5 churches. Researchers have identified the ruins of the cathedral at Gardar, the bishop's residence, and numerous smaller holdings. What they've found consistently defies easy explanation. At Herjolfsnes, once a major trading port, excavators discovered a cemetery containing over 200 burials. Analysis of skeletal remains by researchers including Niels Linnerup from the University of Copenhagen revealed that the late-period Norse Greenlanders were shorter than their ancestors and showed signs of nutritional stress. But they weren't starving. Their bones showed periods of hardship, followed by recovery. The pattern of a people adapting to difficult circumstances, not dying out. Even more revealing were the clothes. The Herjolfsnes, cemetery's permafrost, had preserved medieval garments in extraordinary condition. Over 30 complete or partial items of clothing dating from the 14th and 15th centuries. These weren't the rough homespun of struggling peasants. They were fashionable European garments, tailored in styles that matched contemporary Norwegian and Icelandic clothing. The Norse Greenlanders, even at the end, were maintaining cultural connections to Europe. They were making and wearing elaborate clothing. They were burying their dead with Christian rites. They were participating in the broader medieval world. And then they were gone. Here's where it gets strange, and I mean really strange. A 2019 study published in the Journal of the North Atlantic examined tooth enamel from Norse Greenlandic skeletons using isotope analysis. The results showed that in the final generations, the Norse diet had shifted dramatically toward marine resources. Potentially 80% or more of their calories came from the sea. They had essentially stopped farming. But if they had adopted a maritime hunting economy, why didn't they survive like the Inuit did? The technology and techniques existed. The Inuit demonstrated their viability for millennia before and after. Some viewers have pointed out similarities to other colonial collapse scenarios, but I'm not convinced. What patterns do you see here? Your observations might catch something researchers missed. The environmental hypothesis suggests climate change simply made Greenland uninhabitable for Norse-style agriculture. As temperatures dropped and growing seasons shortened, cattle died and harvests failed. This theory positions the Norse as victims of forces beyond their control, unable to sustain their European lifestyle in the deteriorating Arctic conditions. The isolation hypothesis focuses on the breakdown of trade connections with Europe. The Black Death killed perhaps half of Norway's population, disrupting the maritime networks that supplied Greenland with essential goods, iron, grain, wood, and carried Greenland's exports of walrus ivory and furs to European markets. Without these connections, the theory goes, the colony withered. The cultural rigidity hypothesis argues that the Norse failed because they wouldn't adapt. While the Inuit thrived using kayaks, toggle harpoons, and ice hunting techniques, the Norse clung to their cattle and their farms and their European identity. When conditions changed, they refused to change with them and paid the ultimate price. Each theory has fatal flaws. The climate hypothesis can't explain why the Inuit survived the same conditions. The isolation hypothesis doesn't account for the fact that some Norse likely knew Inuit hunting techniques. Intermarriage and cultural exchange are well documented. And the cultural rigidity hypothesis ignores the isotope evidence showing the Norse did adapt their diet dramatically. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that we've been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking why the Norse disappeared, we should ask where they went. Picture Greenland in 1350. You're a third-generation farmer born in a stone house your grandfather built. The church where you were baptized stands an hour's walk away. You've never seen Norway or Iceland, though your father told you stories. The cattle died last winter. The hay wasn't sufficient, and the cold came early. Your neighbors to the north have already left. Their farms stand empty, tools still hanging on the walls. Ships haven't come from Europe in 3 years. The Inuit camp across the fjord seems to be thriving. You've traded with them occasionally, your iron for their sealskin. Your son has learned some of their language. He's been out on their kayaks. What do you do? The archaeological evidence suggests many Norse did exactly what seems logical. They adapted. They began hunting seals. They adopted new techniques. They may even have intermarried with Inuit communities. But if that's true, where is the evidence? Where are the mixed culture archaeological sites? Where are the Norse artifacts in Inuit context? Where are the genetic signatures? Recent DNA studies have found no significant Norse ancestry in modern Greenlandic Inuit populations. If the Norse were absorbed into Inuit communities, they left no genetic trace. This absence is itself a mystery. 5,000 people don't simply evaporate. Today, Norse ruins in Greenland are protected as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The Qilakitsoq Greenland region, encompassing the eastern settlement area, was inscribed in 2017 specifically to recognize the cultural landscape created by Norse farmers and their Inuit successors. Climate change continues to reveal new sites. Each summer, melting permafrost exposes previously frozen artifacts. In 2015, researchers discovered a Norse cache of textiles that had been sealed in ice for 6 centuries. The fabrics were so well preserved that conservators could identify the weaving techniques used. But the same melting that reveals these treasures threatens them immediately. Organic materials that survived for centuries in frozen conditions begin decomposing within hours of exposure. Field teams race against time, photographing, collecting, and stabilizing finds before they're lost forever. The irony is painful. We're discovering Norse Greenland precisely because the conditions that allowed the Norse to thrive, and that may have contributed to their demise, are returning. Greenland is warming faster than almost anywhere on Earth. The farms that the Little Ice Age made untenable are becoming viable again. Too late for the Norse. But perhaps not too late to learn what happened to them. The Norse failure in Greenland haunts me because it feels familiar. Here was a sophisticated society, connected to a larger world, facing environmental challenges that required adaptation. They had 5 centuries to figure it out. They had neighbors who had solved exactly the same problems. They had intelligence and technology and determination. And they failed. Not dramatically. Not in a single catastrophic moment. They failed gradually, quietly, generation by generation, until one day the last farm stood empty, and the last prayers were said, and the last ship sailed away. If anyone was left to sail it. What makes us think we're different? The Norse weren't foolish. They weren't lazy. They made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, that preserved their identity and their values and their connection to their ancestors. They just made those choices in a world that was changing faster than their culture could adapt. Sound familiar? The mystery of the Norse disappearance isn't really a mystery about medieval history, it's a mirror. And what we see in it should give us pause. In 1986, archaeologists excavating a site called Qilakitsoq on Disco Island in western Greenland found something remarkable: a 4,000-year-old tuft of human hair. The hair had been preserved in the permafrost, protected from decay in the same conditions that preserve mammoth flesh in Siberia and sacrificial victims in the Andes. The find was significant but not unprecedented. Organic material survives in Arctic contexts occasionally. What made this hair extraordinary would only become apparent 2 decades later, when advances in genetic sequencing allowed scientists to do what had previously been impossible. In 2010, a team led by Eske Willerslev at the Center for Geogenetics at the University of Copenhagen published the results of complete genome sequencing on that ancient hair sample. The paper, appearing in the journal Nature, announced something that seemed to violate everything we knew about human migration to the Americas. The man whose hair they sequenced, they called him Inuk, meaning human in Qilakitsoq, was not related to modern Inuit or Native American populations. He belonged to an entirely separate migration from Asia that had arrived in Greenland approximately 4,500 years ago, established a thriving culture across the Arctic, and then completely disappeared, replaced by the ancestors of modern Inuit approximately 1,000 years ago. We had discovered a lost people, a ghost lineage, a population that colonized one of Earth's harshest environments, survived there for 3.5 millennia, and then vanished without leaving descendants. The Qilakitsoq culture, named after the site in Disco Bay, where artifacts were first identified, represents the earliest known human occupation of Greenland. Archaeological evidence shows they arrived around 2500 BCE, spreading from northern Canada across the Arctic archipelago and into Greenland's western coast. Their technology was remarkable. Qilakitsoq sites contain microblades, tiny stone tools designed to be fitted into bone or antler handles that required extraordinary precision to manufacture. Their harpoon heads show sophisticated engineering, with toggling mechanisms that would rotate once embedded in prey, preventing the harpoon from pulling free. They hunted seals, walrus, caribou, and seabirds. They lived in semi-subterranean houses heated with oil lamps fueled by marine mammal blubber. They survived in conditions that would kill unprepared modern humans in hours. But here's the genetic problem. Their DNA connects not to the populations who came before or after them, but to groups in distant Siberia. Inuk's genome showed closest affinity to the Chukchi and Koryak peoples of northeastern Siberia, populations separated from Greenland by thousands of miles of Arctic Ocean and the entire North American continent. His ancestors had apparently traveled from Asia, across the Bering Strait, through Alaska and Canada, and all the way to Greenland, establishing themselves in one of the world's most remote locations. And they did it independently of the ancestors of modern Native Americans and Inuit. The genomic data suggested that the Qilakitsoq-related migration was entirely separate from the earlier migration that populated the Americas, and from the later migration that produced the Thule culture, the ancestors of modern Inuit. 3 distinct waves of people crossed the Bering Strait into the New World. The Qilakitsoq were the middle wave, and they left almost no genetic trace in modern populations. This next part changed my entire perspective on ancient America. Subsequent research published in Science in 2014 analyzed additional ancient genomes from across the Arctic and found the same pattern. The Paleo-Eskimo populations, including the Qilakitsoq, Dorset, and related cultures, represented a genetically distinct lineage that was almost completely replaced by the Thule expansion around 1000 CE. I've shown this to colleagues and gotten completely different reactions every time. What's your gut instinct telling you about this? The 2014 study, led again by Willerslev and including researchers from institutions across North America and Europe, examined genomes from 169 ancient human remains spanning 4,000 years of Arctic occupation. The conclusions were stark. The Paleo-Eskimo lineage, which included the Qilakitsoq, represented a single founding population that colonized the Arctic around 4,500 years ago and remained genetically distinct for over 3 millennia. Despite sharing the same territory, hunting the same animals, and presumably encountering each other regularly, the Paleo-Eskimos and the ancestral Native American populations in neighboring regions maintained genetic separation. Then around 1000 CE, the Thule culture expanded eastward from Alaska. Within a few centuries, the Paleo-Eskimos were gone. The replacement was nearly total. Modern Inuit and Yupik populations show virtually no Paleo-Eskimo ancestry. A few individuals from specific regions show trace admixture, but these represent less than 2% of ancestry and may result from very limited intermarriage. The researchers struggled to explain this finding. Cultural replacement can occur through various mechanisms: conquest, disease, absorption, displacement, but usually leaves genetic signatures. Conquering populations intermarry with the conquered. Absorbed populations contribute ancestry to their absorbers. Even displaced populations typically leave traces through occasional contact. The Paleo-Eskimos left almost nothing. Isotope analysis of Qilakitsoq and later Dorset skeletons showed that they maintained distinct dietary practices from their Thule successors. Even when living in the same regions and hunting the same animals, the two populations prepared and consumed food differently. This suggests minimal cultural exchange even during the period of overlap. Were the Paleo-Eskimos so culturally distinct that integration was impossible? Did they resist absorption? Did the Thule actively eliminate them? We don't know. The genomic evidence reveals the fact of replacement, but not the mechanism. The competition hypothesis suggests that the Thule culture possessed technological advantages, particularly their large skin boats called umiaks and their sophisticated whale hunting techniques that allowed them to outcompete the Paleo-Eskimos for resources. Over time, the Thule expanded into Paleo-Eskimo territory, and the older population simply couldn't compete. The disease hypothesis proposes that the Thule may have carried pathogens to which the Paleo-Eskimos had no immunity. Having been isolated for thousands of years, the Paleo-Eskimos could have been devastated by diseases similar to those that later decimated Native American populations after European contact. The isolation hypothesis suggests that the Paleo-Eskimos may have been culturally or socially isolated by choice. Perhaps their spiritual beliefs, social structures, or marriage practices prevented integration with newcomers. In this view, they didn't disappear through conflict or disease, but through demographic attrition. Their birth rates couldn't match the expanding Thule population. Each theory faces significant problems. The competition hypothesis doesn't explain the near-total genetic replacement. Competition typically produces admixture, not elimination. The disease hypothesis lacks archaeological evidence of epidemic mortality and doesn't explain how diseases would have emerged in the isolated Arctic. The isolation hypothesis requires an extraordinary level of social separation maintained across centuries of overlapping occupation. The most uncomfortable possibility may be the most honest. We simply don't know what happened. The Paleo-Eskimos' disappearance remains one of the great unsolved questions of Arctic prehistory. Inuk lived approximately 4,000 years ago. From his hair, scientists reconstructed not just his genetic ancestry, but aspects of his physical appearance. He likely had brown eyes, dark skin, and the dry earwax common to East Asian populations. He was genetically predisposed to baldness, which makes the preservation of his hair somewhat ironic, and probably had the thick, dark hair common to Arctic peoples. He was a hunter. Isotope analysis of the hair showed he ate primarily marine mammals, with some caribou and fish. He used the sophisticated stone tools found throughout Qilakitsoq sites. He lived in the brief Arctic summer and survived the endless Arctic winter. And he was part of a population that no longer exists. There's something profoundly lonely about the Qilakitsoq. They came to one of Earth's edges, lived there for 3,000 years, developed remarkable technologies, adapted to impossible conditions, and then disappeared without descendants, without successors, without continuation. Every lineage that exists today has an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back to the origin of life. But most lineages end. Most populations, most species, most ways of living, they terminate. They leave fossils or artifacts, or in extraordinary cases, preserved hair with intact DNA. But they don't continue. Inuk was someone's son, probably someone's father. He had a name we'll never know, stories we'll never hear, knowledge we'll never access. He was as fully human as anyone reading these words, and his entire world is gone. The Qilakitsoq genome represents a milestone in ancient DNA research. Its successful sequencing demonstrated that complete genomes could be recovered from archaeological remains under the right preservation conditions. This opened the door to subsequent ancient genome studies that have revolutionized our understanding of human prehistory. Today, the Center for Geogenetics in Copenhagen continues to lead ancient DNA research, with projects examining human migrations across the globe. The techniques developed for Inuk's genome have been applied to samples from around the world, revealing population movements and replacements that were invisible to traditional archaeology. For Greenland specifically, the Qilakitsoq findings have raised awareness of the island's complex human history as modern Greenlandic Inuit are the cultural descendants of the Thule, who arrived roughly 1,000 years ago. The Qilakitsoq and Dorset cultures that preceded them are not ancestral to current populations. They represent parallel experiments in Arctic living that ultimately failed. This realization has complicated discussions about indigenous identity and archaeological heritage in Greenland. The Qilakitsoq sites are not ancestral sites for modern Greenlanders in a genetic sense, yet they represent the earliest human engagement with the land now called home. How should these ancient remains be treated? To whom do they belong? These questions have no easy answers. They're part of a larger global conversation about the relationship between modern indigenous peoples and archaeological remains that may or may not represent their ancestors. The Qilakitsoq challenge our assumptions about human success. They colonized one of the most difficult environments on Earth. They developed technologies that worked for 3 millennia. They passed knowledge from generation to generation, accumulated wisdom, refined techniques. By any reasonable standard, they succeeded. And then they were replaced. Their replacement wasn't caused by failure in any obvious sense. The Thule who succeeded them weren't superior humans. They were simply different humans, with different technologies and different social organizations, and perhaps different luck. The Qilakitsoq's 3,000-year experiment in Arctic living ended not because of their inadequacy, but because history took a different turn. This should humble us. We like to imagine that our civilizations, our technologies, our ways of living are special, that our success demonstrates our worthiness to persist. The Qilakitsoq remind us that survival is not a merit badge. Cultures that succeed for millennia can still disappear, and cultures that replace them may themselves be replaced in turn. The ice remembers everyone. The ice forgets everyone. Inuk's hair, preserved by accident, reveals his genome, but his name, his songs, his stories, his prayers, these the ice did not preserve. We have his biology. We've lost everything that made him human. In August 2015, a team of climate scientists studying ice sheet dynamics in northern Greenland made an accidental discovery. While establishing monitoring equipment near the flayed Isblink ice cap, they noticed something protruding from the edge of the retreating ice. Wood, not driftwood, not modern debris. Worked wood, the remains of what appeared to be a structure. The site, located approximately 1,500 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, in one of the most remote locations on Earth, shouldn't have contained human-worked wood. The region was believed to have been permanently ice-covered for at least 10,000 years. No known human cultures had established settlements this far north during any period when the area might have been accessible. The scientists immediately contacted archaeologists at the Greenland National Museum. What followed was a frantic, inadequately funded, logistically nightmarish excavation conducted during the brief summer window before winter returned. What they found challenged existing models of Arctic human settlement and raised urgent questions about what else the melting ice might be revealing and destroying before we can study it. The site, which researchers have kept deliberately vague in published literature to prevent looting, contained the remains of at least 2 structures and numerous artifacts. Radiocarbon dating placed the occupation at approximately 4,200 years ago, the late Qilakitsoq period, or possibly early Independence II culture. But the location made no sense. Current models of Paleo-Eskimo expansion suggested that permanent settlements this far north were impossible. The sea ice would have been too extensive, the winters too dark, the resources too scarce. This region was transit territory at best, a place you might pass through during summer hunting expeditions, not a place you would build wooden structures. Yet here were the structures, the wooden beams, spruce and larch, species that don't grow in Greenland and must have been driftwood collected from distant sources, showed careful shaping and fitting. Whoever built these structures invested considerable effort, suggesting they planned to stay for extended periods. Stone tools scattered around the site included microblades and burin-like implements consistent with Qilakitsoq technology, but with some distinctive features not documented elsewhere. Most intriguing were a series of carved bone objects that appeared to be astronomical markers. Similar objects have been found at other Qilakitsoq sites, leading some researchers to propose that the Qilakitsoq used bone calendars to track the movement of stars and the returning sun, essential information for surviving the months of winter darkness. But the markers at this site showed variations that suggested tracking something different. Rather than the standard solar and stellar alignments, these objects appeared calibrated for polar phenomena, possibly the movement of the northern lights or the behavior of ice. Were the Qilakitsoq more sophisticated astronomers than we recognized? Were they tracking environmental phenomena we haven't connected to their survival strategies? Did they understand patterns in the Arctic environment that we're only beginning to document? The finds were rushed to climate-controlled storage, but the site itself couldn't be protected. By the following summer, additional melting had destabilized the structures, and erosion from meltwater streams had scattered artifacts across the emerging landscape. What might have been a systematic excavation became a salvage operation. This pattern repeats across Greenland. The warming climate reveals sites, and the warming climate immediately begins destroying them. Ice patch archaeology has become an increasingly urgent subdiscipline since the early 2000s. As permanent ice and snowfields melt, they release materials that were frozen in place for centuries or millennia. In the Alps, melting glaciers have revealed Bronze Age artifacts and Ice Age mammal remains. In the Rockies, ancient hunting implements have emerged from snow patches. And in Greenland and Arctic Canada, the melting permafrost and retreating ice sheets are exposing sites at an unprecedented rate. The Greenland ice sheet currently loses approximately 280 billion tons of ice annually. That loss accelerates each decade. The ice that took thousands of years to accumulate is disappearing in decades. For archaeologists, this represents both an opportunity and a tragedy. Materials preserved in frozen conditions, wood, leather, textiles, hair, skin, decompose within hours or days once exposed to air and water. A site that waited 4,000 years to be discovered can be destroyed in a single summer. Researchers at institutions including the National Museum of Denmark, the Greenland National Museum, and the University of Colorado's Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research have developed protocols for rapid response to ice patch discoveries. Teams are trained to mobilize quickly, document extensively, and prioritize the most fragile materials. But resources are limited. Greenland's archaeological community is small, and the territory is vast. Sites are discovered by accident, by hunters, hikers, scientists studying other phenomena, and often in locations accessible only by helicopter. By the time a team can be assembled and transported, days or weeks may have passed. In 2018, a caribou hunter reported what appeared to be a preserved garment emerging from an ice patch in eastern Greenland. By the time archaeologists arrived 3 weeks later, the garment had largely decomposed, leaving only fragments that hinted at sophisticated construction techniques never before documented in Greenlandic contexts. An irreplaceable artifact was lost because the logistics of Arctic research couldn't match the pace of Arctic warming. On the broader implications of ice patch discoveries, 3 perspectives have emerged. The optimistic view holds that melting ice is revealing a bonanza of archaeological information. Sites that were previously inaccessible are now available for study. Materials that would have remained frozen forever are now providing DNA, isotopes, and organic evidence impossible to obtain from conventional archaeological contexts. Yes, the race against time is challenging, but the information gained outweighs what's lost. The pessimistic view argues that we're witnessing a catastrophic loss of heritage. For every site that's properly documented, dozens or hundreds are destroyed without ever being recorded. The pace of melting exceeds our capacity to respond. We're watching a library burn, and our fire department consists of a handful of researchers with inadequate funding. The pragmatic view suggests that we must triage. Resources should be concentrated on the most significant sites, accepting that many discoveries will be lost. Rather than attempting comprehensive coverage, which is impossible, we should develop predictive models to to identify high-potential areas and prioritize monitoring those zones. All three views contain truth. The discoveries are genuinely revelatory, the losses are genuinely devastating, and triage is genuinely necessary. But none of these perspectives addresses the fundamental problem. We are destroying these sites. Climate change is a human creation, and the archaeological losses it causes are ultimately human responsibility. Consider what it meant to live in northern Greenland 4,200 years ago. Winter darkness lasted months, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, sea ice extended to the horizon. Blizzards could strand you in your house for weeks, and you chose to be there. The Qilakitsoq people who built those structures near Flayed Isblink could have lived farther south, where conditions were marginally less severe. They didn't. They pushed into some of the most extreme conditions on Earth, and they did it deliberately. Why? Perhaps they followed game animals, caribou, musk oxen, seals, that congregated in areas less exploited by human hunters. Perhaps they sought materials, specific stone types, driftwood deposits, available only in the far north. Perhaps spiritual or cultural factors drew them to the edge of the inhabitable world. Or perhaps they simply wanted to know what was there. Humans explore. We push boundaries not because we must, but because we can. Because the question of what lies beyond drives us forward even when forward means into cold and darkness and danger. The Qilakitsoq at that northern site were explorers. They went where no one had gone before, and they survived there, at least for a time. The structures they built, the tools they used, the observations they recorded in bone. These are the testimony of people testing limits. And now, thousands of years later, we're testing limits of our own. We're warming the planet at rates unprecedented in human history. We're melting ice that has been stable for longer than our species has existed. We're discovering the traces of ancient explorers precisely because we're conducting an uncontrolled experiment with Earth's climate. There's a bitter irony in learning about ancient adaptation to climate extremes precisely because our modern inability to adapt is destroying the evidence. Greenland's archaeological community has advocated for increased funding and international support for ice patch monitoring. In 2020, the Greenland National Museum proposed a systematic survey of retreating ice margins, prioritizing areas with known historical activity. The proposal remains unfunded. Meanwhile, individual researchers continue documenting what they can. Dr. Jorgen Meldgaard's comprehensive surveys of Thule and Qilakitsoq sites in the 1960s established baseline data that allows modern researchers to track changes. New sites are added to the record each year, some properly excavated, many simply photographed and GPS logged before conditions render them inaccessible. The COVID-19 pandemic interrupted Arctic field research in 2020 and 2021, meaning 2 summer seasons, 2 opportunities to document emerging sites, were largely lost. Researchers returning in 2022 found sites that had been reported previously were now unrecognizable, their materials scattered and decomposed. The timeline is unforgiving. Climate models suggest Greenland's ice sheet will continue losing mass for centuries, even if global carbon emissions reach net zero tomorrow. The melting isn't something we can stop. It's something we can only watch. What emerges from that melting will tell us about ourselves, about our ancestors, our capabilities, our failures. Whether we'll be able to read those messages before they're erased depends on decisions being made now, today, about resource allocation and research priorities. The ice held these secrets for millennia. It's releasing them in decades. And we have perhaps a few years to catch them before they're gone. After everything we've explored, which of these mysteries disturbed you the most? And more importantly, why do you think these stories were hidden for so long? For me, the melting ice carries the most haunting implications. The other mysteries, the Qilakitsoq dead, the vanished Norse, the replaced sakak, involve human choices, human failures, human disappearances. They're tragedies, but they're human tragedies, and we can learn from them as humans. The ice is different. The ice is indifferent. It preserved what it preserved by accident and reveals what it reveals without intent. It doesn't care whether we document the emerging sites or whether they wash away unstudied. It doesn't care that we're the ones who caused the warming. But we care, or we should. The sites emerging from Greenland's ice are messages from ancestors we barely knew existed. They're saying something about resilience, adaptation, and the limits of human endurance. They're offering lessons we desperately need, lessons about how to survive in a changing world, about what happens to societies that can't or won't adapt, about the difference between thriving and merely persisting. And we're losing those messages almost as fast as they appear. This isn't just an archaeological tragedy. It's a metaphor for our broader relationship with the past and the future. We're destroying our heritage and our climate simultaneously, racing to document what's being lost without addressing why it's being lost. The ice won't wait for us to figure this out. Greenland's ice sheet has held secrets for longer than human civilization has existed. For millennia, those secrets remained frozen, protected by the cold from decay and from discovery. We couldn't know what we couldn't access. Now we're accessing it all at once, but not because we became more capable, because the ice is dying. We've explored 4 windows into Greenland's hidden past: the mummies of Qilakitsoq, whose burial circumstances remain unexplained after 5 decades of research; the Norse settlements, whose complete disappearance challenges our assumptions about civilization's resilience; the Sakak genome, which revealed a ghost population that survived for 3 millennia before vanishing without descendants; and the emerging ice patch sites, which offer tantalizing glimpses of ancient knowledge while slipping through our fingers. Each mystery connects to the others. The Qilakitsoq people were descendants of the Thule culture that replaced the Sakak. The Norse lived alongside the ancestors of the Qilakitsoq mummies, trading and potentially conflicting before their own disappearance. The ice that preserved the oldest sites is the same ice now revealing the newest discoveries, and all of them speak to the fundamental challenge of human existence in marginal environments. How do we persist? How do we adapt? What happens when we can't? These questions aren't academic. They're urgent. We face climate changes that will transform our world as thoroughly as the Little Ice Age transformed Norse Greenland. We face potential population displacements that will rival the Thule expansion that erased the Sakak. We face decisions about cultural identity and adaptation that echo the choices the Qilakitsoq families made when they buried their dead in that windswept overhang. What we learn from Greenland's past could inform our collective future, but only if we learn it in time. The ice is melting, the secrets are emerging, the clock is running, and we're discovering these mysteries just in time to watch them disappear. The Arctic doesn't wait. The Arctic doesn't care. The Arctic simply is, cold and beautiful and filled with stories we're only beginning to hear. Whether we'll listen long enough to understand them remains, perhaps, the greatest mystery of all.